The file in front of you was never officially closed. The investigators moved on. The witnesses stopped talking. The leads ran dry, but the case never closed. What you are about to hear has been documented. The timeline, the evidence, the questions that were never answered. Welcome to case number unknown. Let's open the file. In the summer of 1973, a 17-year-old boy picked up a phone in Pasadena, Texas, and called the police. He told them he had just killed a man. When officers arrived at the scene, they found the body of 33-year-old Dean Arnold Corll lying on the hallway floor of his home at 2020 Lamar Drive, shot 6 times with a .22 caliber pistol. The teenager who had pulled the trigger, Elmer Wayne Henley, then uttered words that would change the course of Houston's history forever. He told the officers that the dead man had killed at least 28 boys. He said he could show them where the bodies were buried. What followed was the largest serial murder investigation in American history at that time, a case so horrific that it would haunt the Houston Heights neighborhood for generations. This is the story of the Houston Candy Man. Dean Arnold Corll was born on Christmas Eve, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to Arnold and Mary Corll. By most early accounts, his childhood was unremarkable, though shadowed by his parents' troubled marriage. Arnold and Mary divorced, remarried each other, and divorced again, creating an atmosphere of instability that followed young Dean through his formative years. In 1960, the family moved to Houston Heights, a working-class neighborhood on the north side of Houston, Texas. There, Mary Corll opened a small candy factory called the Corll Candy Company, and Dean became a fixture in the business, helping his mother make pecan pralines, popcorn bowls, and other sweets. He would hand out free candy to the children in the neighborhood, earning the nickname that would later take on a deeply sinister meaning: the Candy Man. To the outside world, Dean Corll seemed like a polite, quiet, hardworking young man. He served in the Army for a period in the early 1960s before returning to Houston to help run the candy company. Neighbors described him as friendly and generous. He was the kind of man who offered neighborhood kids rides in his van and invited them over to his home for parties. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, something profoundly dark was taking shape. After the candy company closed in 1968, Corll took a job as an electrician at the Houston Lighting and Power Company. It was around this time that he began cultivating relationships with 2 teenage boys who would become his accomplices in a campaign of abduction, torture, and murder that would span 3 years. David Owen Brooks was the first. Born in 1955, Brooks came from a troubled home and found in Corll someone who gave him attention, money, and eventually a car. Brooks later told investigators that Corll had begun sexually assaulting him when he was just 12 years old. The second accomplice was Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., born in 1956, another boy from the Heights who came from poverty and a broken family. Corll drew both teenagers into his orbit with gifts, alcohol, drugs, and cash. He paid them $200 for every boy they could bring to him. $200 for a human life. And so the killing began. The first known victim was 18-year-old Jeffrey Conan, a University of Texas student who disappeared on September 25, 1970, while hitchhiking near campus. Over the next 3 years, at least 27 more boys and young men would vanish, most of them between the ages of 13 and 20, many of them from the Houston Heights neighborhood itself. Corll had a method. Brooks and Henley would befriend the victims, lure them to one of Corll's residences with the promise of a party, drugs, or a ride, and once inside, Corll would overpower them, sometimes with the help of his teenage accomplices. The victims would be handcuffed or tied to a plywood torture board that Corll had constructed specifically for this purpose. What happened next is almost beyond description. Corll subjected his victims to prolonged sexual assault and torture, sometimes for days, before strangling or shooting them to death. The bodies were buried in 3 primary locations: a rented boat shed at Southwest Boat Storage in Houston, became a makeshift cemetery, with 17 victims eventually recovered from beneath its dirt floor. 6 more were found buried near the shores of Lake Sam Rayburn in East Texas. 4 additional victims were discovered at a beach on High Island, along the Bolivar Peninsula on the Gulf Coast. The scale of the burial operation was staggering. Corll and his accomplices would drive for hours to dispose of the bodies, carefully selecting remote locations where they believed no one would ever look. What makes this case even more disturbing is how completely the disappearances went unnoticed by law enforcement. Houston in the early 1970s was a booming, chaotic city. The Heights was a neighborhood where runaway teenagers were common, where poverty drove families apart, and where police often dismissed missing persons reports involving young men as voluntary departures. Parents begged the Houston Police Department for help. Some filed missing persons reports that were never properly investigated. Others were told their sons had probably just run away. The systemic failures were catastrophic. In a wealthier neighborhood, the disappearance of 28 young people over 3 years would have triggered a massive investigation. In the Heights, it barely registered. The reign of terror came to an abrupt and chaotic end on August 8, 1973. That evening, Henley had brought 2 friends to Corll's home on Lamar Drive, a 15-year-old girl named Rhonda Williams and a 19-year-old boy named Timothy Curley. Corll was initially furious that Henley had brought a girl, as Corll's victims were exclusively male. But as the night wore on, the group sniffed paint fumes and acrylic paint from a paper bag and eventually passed out. When Henley regained consciousness, he found himself handcuffed and bound alongside Williams and Curley. Corll was standing over them, enraged. He told Henley he was going to kill all 3 of them. But Henley, who had been through this cycle before as an accomplice, managed to talk Corll down. He promised to help torture and kill the other 2 if Corll would release him. Corll agreed and freed Henley from his restraints. What happened next would be the only act that separated Henley from being just another of Corll's victims or just another of his willing accomplices. As Corll began to assault Timothy Curley, Henley grabbed Corll's own .22 caliber pistol from a nearby table. He pointed it at the older man and told him to stop. Corll reportedly turned to Henley and said, "Go ahead and kill me, Wayne, but you won't do it." Henley pulled the trigger. He fired 6 rounds into Dean Corll's body, killing him in the hallway of his own home. He then called the Pasadena Police Department. At first, the officers who arrived treated it as a simple homicide. But Henley kept talking. He told them about the boat shed. He told them about the torture board. He told them about the boys. The excavation of the Southwest Boat Storage Facility began on August 9, 1973, and what investigators found there was beyond their worst nightmares. Body after body was pulled from the packed earth beneath the shed, many wrapped in plastic sheeting, many showing signs of horrific trauma. As the count rose from 5 to 10 to 15, the national media descended on Houston. Headlines screamed across the country. How had this happened? How had 28 boys disappeared from a single neighborhood without anyone connecting the dots? The digging continued at Lake Sam Rayburn and High Island, each location yielding more remains. In total, 28 victims were identified, though both Henley and Brooks suggested the true number could be higher. Some remains were never conclusively identified during the initial investigation, and to this day, questions linger about whether additional victims exist. David Brooks was arrested on August 9, 1973, and Elmer Wayne Henley was already in custody. Both were charged with multiple counts of murder. Their trials, held separately, drew massive public attention. Henley was convicted of 6 counts of murder in 1974 and sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year prison terms. He remains incarcerated to this day at the Ramsey Unit in Brazoria County, Texas. He is now in his 60s and has been denied parole repeatedly. David Brooks was convicted of 1 count of murder and also sentenced to life in prison. He died in custody on May 28, 2020, from complications related to COVID-19. Dean Corll never faced justice in a courtroom. His death at Henley's hands ensured that he was buried in a simple grave in Grand Prairie, Texas, and his story became a cautionary tale about how monsters can hide behind the most ordinary of masks. A man who handed out candy to children. A man his neighbors called polite. A man who tortured and murdered at least 28 young people while an entire city looked the other way. The legacy of the Houston mass murders, as the case came to be known, extends far beyond the crimes themselves. It exposed catastrophic failures in the Houston Police Department's handling of missing persons cases. It shattered the myth that serial killers were lone wolves who acted without help, and it left families permanently scarred, some of whom waited decades to learn what had happened to their sons. Several victims were not identified until advances in DNA technology allowed forensic scientists to match remains with family members years later. As recently as 2011, previously unidentified remains were finally given a name. Tonight, as you watch this, Elmer Wayne Henley sits in a Texas prison cell, the only surviving participant in one of America's worst serial murder cases. He has expressed what he calls remorse. He has painted hundreds of artworks from behind bars, some of which have been controversially sold online. But here is the question that still haunts investigators and families alike. Did they find all the victims? Both Henley and Brooks hinted at numbers higher than 28. Some missing persons cases from 1970s Houston were never resolved. Is it possible that somewhere beneath the Texas soil, more victims of the Candyman are still waiting to be found? The investigation is ongoing. If you have a case you think deserves a file, leave it in the comments. New files open every week. Subscribe, because the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how long it takes.